Author Jane Leavy joins me to talk about a book that she's just released. It's called Babe Ruth and the World He Created. His picture and the title, The Big Fella. It's a really neat cover of the book, and I really can't wait to read it, actually. Jane joining us from Chicago. Babe Ruth is one of those icons in sports that we don't know a whole lot about. Jane, since we weren't alive, most of us, what made you decide to write a book about him and his celebrity?
I think I'm completely nuts. I mean, it was the craziest decision I've made in a long time. And the consequence is that I spent 8 years doing it.
Wow.
I like to tell everybody that I own a new major league record for most consecutive nights spent alone with Babe Ruth. Because he could leave his wives, but he couldn't leave me.
Oh.
So I've gotten to know him pretty well. I actually spent a whole year before agreeing to sign a contract reading everything that had been written about him, and a lot of it's very, very good, but none of it had anything about his childhood. And as a reporter, it was just one of those things that, my eyebrows shot right up, and I said, there's something missing here. There's some untold story, and I'm going to go get it. And luckily, what I thought was going to be a disaster, meaning that there was nobody alive to talk to, they're all presently dead, but it turned into something completely different, which is that I was able to get material that my predecessors couldn't get because everything's now digitized. So all the old newspapers that, are now out of business, you can find online. And all the family records that were buried for, decades are now online. And as a consequence, I was able to ferret out the story of Babe Ruth's childhood and the years that were so formative that made him into the big fella.
So what was he like?
Well, it's not so much what he was like, Amy. It's that there are two competing myths that survived him. One was that he was an orphan, and that came simply from the fact that people thought that St. Mary's Industrial School in Baltimore, where he spent his childhood, was an orphanage. It wasn't an orphanage. It was a reform school. So the other half of the world thought, oh, he needed some reforming. He must have been one of those incorrigible kids sent there by the courts. And so there were, and both of these things were untrue. What he managed to keep quiet for his entire lifetime and another 70 years past was the complete disintegration of his family and his parents' marriage. George Herman Ruth Sr. and Kate Ruth were divorced. And not only were they divorced, it was announced in the Baltimore Sun. But there is no way any reporter in the pre-digitized age, short of reading every edition of the Baltimore Sun for 1906, would have been able to find that, unless somebody had given them a hint or a date or something. And I got that hint from Babe's daughter, Julia, who's 102. And
she's still alive?
Yeah, she is.
Oh, my gosh!
And living in Henderson, Nevada. Lovely, lovely, lovely woman who said to me the first time I met her, well, George and Kate were separated. And I went, what? I said, no, I didn't know, and nobody knew. And she said, oh, I just thought everybody knew. And with that hint, I was then able to go into Maryland State Records and find not just the arrest, because George had Kate arrested after he found her in a compromising position with one of his bartenders. Oh yeah, it's ugly. He had her arrested. He threw her out. He announced in the newspaper he was no longer responsible for any of her debts, and he not only divorced her within 2.5 months, but he got custody of their 3 surviving children. Now, one of the few things I wasn't able to figure out is the exact number of children they had. Babe's sister, Mamie, who is now deceased, but the only other one to survive to adulthood. Always said there were 8 kids. I could only find documentation for 6.
Wow.
But of those 6, 4 died in infancy. And of the 4 who died, 2 died from malnutrition. So picture your Babe Ruth, only you're not Babe yet. You're just little George. And you've seen 4 siblings die, and there's only 2 of you left, and despite that, they still send you away. And when I learned all that stuff, my heart went out to this kid, this little boy who is so geeky and weird looking with ears that stuck out and gigantic hands, and I just wanted to give him a hug.
Oh, and it's crazy that he turned into a figure who's larger than life. We're spending a few minutes with Jane Leavy, who's the author of The Big Fella, Babe Ruth, and the World He Created. And she also previously covered the Orioles for the Washington Post. It's After Hours here on CBS Sports Radio. So how did he make that transition from this kid that you wanted to hug to one of our first celebrities as a country?
Well, you know, at St. Mary's, it was always overcrowded. They did take orphans. They did take boarding students. And Babe Ruth was a boarding student, believe it or not, whose father paid for him to be there. But these kids slept in dorms that were perennially underfunded and overcrowded, long rows of wrought iron cots that had nothing personal. They all every bed looked alike, and there was just enough room between them to get down on your hands and knees and pray. And these kids ate together, slept together, bathed together, and God knows they played a lot of baseball together. So what Babe Ruth knew, what he learned growing up there, was how to be public. He had no privacy. What he didn't know how to be was alone. So once he's thrust into a situation in the major leagues where suddenly there's this attention, he thrives on it. That's what's normal for him. And if you see the pictures of him surrounded by, masses of children hanging on his arms and his legs and draping themselves all over him, there's no hint of claustrophobia. He's not trying to get away from them. There's no bouncers. There's no body men. He's just loving it because it's filling up some part of him that had been left empty through his entire life.
You like to describe Christy Walsh, who is someone who is close to Babe Ruth, as the original Jerry Maguire. So what role did Christy play in him becoming this celebrity?
So Christy Walsh was the first sports agent. And when he approached Babe Ruth in February 1921, he was out of work, which he frequently was. He was a failed ad man, PR man, newspaper cartoonist, and he was so desperate, his nephew told me, to sign Babe Ruth to a contract for a ghostwriting syndicate, that he found out where he was staying in a New York hotel. It was most probably the Ansonia, which was then both a residence and a residential hotel on the west side, climbed up the fire escape. There was a crack. The window in Babe Ruth's room was cracked open. He climbed in, found Babe in bed with a blonde, slapped him on the butt, and said, "I want to represent you."
Oh, my gosh.
This was the kind of gumption that Babe Ruth would have admired, along with the fact that Christy Walsh offered him $500 per article of byline stories under Babe Ruth's name that would be written by somebody else, compared to the $5 per article he had been receiving prior. So he signs up with Walsh for this ghostwriting syndicate, and by the mid-20s, Walsh is running his entire life and is organizing a separate company just to manage Babe Ruth's affairs. And he recognized before anybody else, in a really amazingly visionary way, that athletes were more than just performers on the field whose deeds could be quantified, that they're entertainers who would be and should be paid for what they bring into the stadium, not just the balls they hit out of the stadium. And so he put his face on everything from toothpaste and shaving cream to, I mean, you name it, Babe Ruth sold it. And in 1927, which is when the book is, centered on, when he hits the 60th home run and he leads the Yankees to a sweep of the Pirates in the World Series and hits the only 2 home runs, Babe Ruth made as much money off the field from endorsements and vaudeville and barnstorming as he did from baseball. And when you add those 2 things up in 2016 dollars, comes out to $36 million.
Whoa, why was America so obsessed with him? You talk about this and about how he turned into a celebrity. Why were people so obsessed with Babe Ruth?
Well, I think he was synonymous with a kind of American bravado and literally clout that, was the essence of the 20s and of a kind of recklessness and abandon and joy. I mean, this guy loved being who he was. He loved making promises, audacious as they were, and keeping them. So, for example, on New Year's Day in 1927, a newspaper in New York asks him to make a promise or a New Year's resolution for the Yankees, and he says, "I promise 60 home runs to Jake."
Oh, my gosh.
Meaning Jacob Rupert, the owner of the Yankees, which was really wild considering he hadn't hit more than 54 of them since 1921. But he was the kind of guy who kept promises, and people love a daredevil like that.
That is true. Jane Levy's with us here. She wrote The Big Fella, Babe Ruth and the World He Created, and it sounds fascinating. Before I let you go, what is something that you learned about, other than his childhood, that you learned maybe about his baseball career that you didn't know, considering that you also covered the sport as a beat writer for a while?
Well, he was literally bigger than the game when he came into it in 1914. He stood literally head and shoulders over all the other guys in uniform. They all looked like they were like little leaguers compared to him. He was 6'1", 6'1.5", 190, 195 pounds, not the big fat slob of caricature. He was a long, lean drink of water, and he had hands that looked as big as backhoes, which explains how he could both swing a 54-ounce bat and how he could also control a baseball and throw it with as much purpose as he did. As you know, from the World Series just finished, in 1916, he pitched a 14-inning game in the World Series, 13.1 scoreless innings.
Well, that's just unheard of now. It sounds like there are a lot of myths and a lot of stories about him that were completely untrue. And now I can't wait to really hear about this man. The Big Fella, that's what it's called. It's by Jane Leavy, and it's Babe Ruth and the World He Created. He was the original celebrity, but there was a lot of pain behind that big, larger-than-life persona as well. It's already out. You can find Jane on Twitter at JaneLevy1 or JaneLevy.com. My goodness, I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much for a couple of minutes.
Oh, my pleasure. Why don't I send you an autographed copy?
That would be even better. Thank you, Jane.
My pleasure, Amy. Take good care.